The following show is brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, Blue Star Strategies, Bright Road Incorporated, Make It Plain Podcast, and RPC Media.
From the campus of the University of the District of Columbia, this is State of Play.
Welcome to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt. With me, Karen Tramontano. Today, we're going to have a book special, our very first book special. And as you know, almost all of our conversations, indeed all of our conversations, we provide historical context. So as we explore the role of books, especially in terms of the Black social movement in America, we wanted to have an expert to provide us with that context. And we have the perfect expert, Dr. Joshua Clark Davis. He is a professor of American history at the University of Baltimore. And this has been his particular focus. He's written a book called From Head Shops to Whole Foods, The Rise and Fall of Social Entrepreneurs. What an honor it is to have you with us.
Yes, thank you for having me today.
You know, it's a fascinating focus, yours both at the university and with your book, how social or activists actually convert that activism into something in the capitalist system. How does that work?
Yeah, well, it's a big question, but the book essentially is about political activists out of the 1960s and 70s who, at one point or another, decided that they wanted to try to implement their values and advance their movements through the businesses that they would open. So I looked at a range of businesses, feminist-owned businesses, environmentalists who started organic food stores, and Black-owned bookstores growing out of the Black Power movement, which we're talking about today.
So, Professor Davis, how did the Black-owned bookstores advance the social movement in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, I'll say this, most people, it'll be obvious to them, but we're talking about a pre-internet era, of course. There was no Google, and if you wanted to access new ideas, exciting new political thinkers, if you wanted to learn about a movement, maybe you had heard on TV about some crazy group called the Black Panthers, but you don't know anything else about them. In communities across the country, there were Black-owned bookstores opening up that, in a sense, were kind of the informational clearinghouses for the civil rights and Black Power movements of the 60s. They were places where someone who knew nothing could go in and learn about a whole world of activism and politics if they wanted to. It was also a place where very seasoned activists could go to connect with other activists. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the role that these played politically.
So I gathered from your works that they got a lot of pushback, official pushback. Could you elaborate on that?
That's right. So in 1968, J. Edgar Hoover, then the director of the FBI, announced the beginning of COINTELPRO, which, is a lot of your viewers know, was a counterintelligence program aimed at a number of different political movements, Black Panthers being one of the most prominent ones. And about 6 months after Hoover announced COINTELPRO, he issued a memo that went to all FBI agents, pleading with them to keep track of any, what he called, African-type bookstores, to track the stores, to track their customers, their owners, to go into them, see what was being sold, and to try to figure out if they were meeting places for dangerous radicals.
In your book, you talk about, the steady growth of Black-owned bookstores, and at some point, it peaked and there was a decline. Did the Hoover activities have anything to do with that decline, or give us a little bit more about that trajectory?
It's hard to imagine that law enforcement surveillance and pressure didn't hurt these stores. At the very least, if you noticed people who look like law enforcement going in and out of a business, a lot of people don't want to patronize that business, don't want to hang around there if they think it's kind of a dodgy place to hang out. Maybe it's a place where someone could get in trouble if there's going to be an FBI agent at the local bookstore. But what happened also in the 70s is the economy tanked. There was a terrible recession. There was terrible inflation. There was also, I think, a slow decline of the Black Power movement. The radical wing of the movement kind of petered out through the 70s. But then what happened, there's kind of been two big resurgences. The first big resurgence was in the late 80s and early 90s, kind of that Malcolm X revival moment where Spike Lee brought the movie out, and there are people all over the country, especially in Black communities, listening to groups like Public Enemy and other political hip hop groups. But I think now in the last 5 years, we're seeing another resurgence in Black-owned bookstores and also just generally commercial appeal of Black literature, and its presence kind of in our country has really expanded. It never went away, but publishers are quote unquote rediscovering it today.
So given that history and given the excitement and energy of those books of that era, and you're speaking to the social inflection point I guess we're in today, are there any books you think we ought to recommend to our audience to read now?
There are so many that, last summer, I think there was a week where the entire New York Times nonfiction bestseller list, every single one of the top 10 books was a book about race and or racism. One of the most famous ones is Ibram X. Kendi's work. He's got several works, but I think what's important is for people to find a book that speaks to them. There are so many different books to appeal to different people. Some who have, for whatever reason, never thought about racism in their life. Usually white people who it hasn't really been an issue for them, to much, people who have experienced racism on a daily basis. But I think what's still important about Black-owned bookstores, as opposed to Amazon, is the curating that goes into the selection. And if you can find one of those bookstores in DC, it's places like Mahogany, they can steer you to works that appeal to your interests.
Well, I tell you, you've been a font of information, and you certainly provided us the historical context of the importance of books during social movements. So we can't really thank you enough for being on State of Play.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Welcome back to State of Play. As you know, this is our first annual book festival. We at State of Play almost always look at historical works, but today we are celebrating all African American authors. And as a result, we have the perfect guests, Derrick and Ramunda Young. They are the founders of Mahogany Books in Anacostia. What an honor to have both of you with us.
Thank you for having us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So what inspired you to open a bookstore? Can you tell us something about your journey?
Yeah, actually, wow. When I think of it, our physical location opened up in Washington, D.C. in 2017. But in 2007, 10 years prior, we began our entrepreneurial journey and started Mahogany Books online. So we've been in business almost a total of 14 years, 10 of those online, and almost 4 in the physical store in Anacostia. But I am proud to be from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and grew up near Black Wall Street. But in my growing up years, I didn't have access to Black books. Didn't really find out about the great world of Black books until I attended college at Langston University. And then fast forward to meeting my husband, we were tossing around business ideas, and going online was to us one of the quickest, most effective, most powerful ways to reach people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Kentucky, California, to make Black books accessible no matter where you lived. And so online was the way that we started, was the way that we were able to build a following nationwide and to open up a physical space was something that we always dreamt about, having a physical space that we could then help curate what people saw, what people heard, what people smelled, and really feel like culture was representative of us and themselves when they walked across our threshold. So that physical space was crucial for our next level in Mahogany Books and making books accessible.
Since the death of George Floyd and the uprising of social protests, there seems to have been an uptick in interest with African American works. I mean, you could see it on the New York Times bestseller list. Have you seen that impact with Mahogany bookstores?
Yes, we did. It still is surreal. We take it as an opportunity to further educate people. I mean, these conversations we were already having in our store. These are the kind of book events we were having in our store, the book club discussions. But with the happening of George Floyd's killing, it gave us an opportunity to continue to push out our story that these things are happening, and we need to find a way to create a different structure that allows our people to be safe in the streets.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. It was overwhelming to me. Between May, George Floyd's murder, and October, our small bookstore sold over 100,000 books. Nothing would have prepared us for what we saw during that time. There were so many people that were not our usual customers looking to buy those books, and so we were able to provide that for them.
Do you think that trend will continue, or will it settle down?
No, we've seen it a downtick in those same type of orders. However, what we're being even more concentrated on is to make sure that these books that we sold, we have a follow-up type kind of conversation with people who are allies in our struggle, as well as people who have been living this for the last 20, 30 years, to make sure that we can capitalize on this opportunity to make change.
Well, you've certainly given us great insight and much reason for encouragement. And you are certainly exemplars. Thank you so very, very much for being with us on State of Play.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Welcome back to State of Play. So this is our first book special for State of Play. We hope it will be an annual book special. And we've talked with authors, we've talked with bookstore owners, we've talked with an historian who talked about the experience of African Americans with bookstores, etc. And now we have someone who can cover the full spectrum, Troy Johnson. He's the founder of the African American Literary Book Club. What a joy to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you. So can you give us a sense of your journey? What prompted you to start this book club, and what has that experience been like?
Well, first of all, it's been a tremendous experience. I started it it was a sheer accident. Mid-1990s, I was building websites for other small businesses. And one of my clients she enjoyed a website, but she wasn't making money. And I decided to create a website to make money so that I could better advise my clients. And I decided to sell books. At the time, Barnes & Noble had an affiliate program. And I thought it'd be a quick and easy way to figure out how to engage in e-commerce on the web. And I immediately discovered a whole world of books that I was previously unaware of. And I became very passionate about it. And I was just fueled with the desire to share that passion with anyone who would pay attention.
So you've obviously been successful to the extent that you're still here. Who particularly flocks to your site and excited about it? Would be writers, or is it interested readers, or are publishers helpful? How has it been?
All of those and more. So yeah, readers often who are just as passionate, actually more passionate about books than I am, flock to the site because they're likely to discover something that's not promoted anywhere else. Authors, of course, who are looking for a platform to help promote their books, use the site for that reason, and they could take advantage of the site through advertising, participate in our discussion forums, and just notify me about what they're doing. Publishers, the same deal. They see ALBC as a tremendous platform to reach readers who are interested in books written by or about people of African descent. And and increasingly, there's been a lot of attention from international publishers who are interested in reaching an American audience. So I deal with people, throughout the diaspora and Africa. So it's been a tremendous ride, and I've met a wide variety of very interesting people with tremendous ideas, and it's just been terrific.
So, Mr. Johnson, you've been doing this for 25 years. Talk to us about the trends that you're seeing in what people are reading in art and culture over that span.
Yeah, there have been a number of dramatic changes that I've seen in the almost 25 years I've been running the site. When I first started the website, I could almost sit around and twiddle my fingers waiting for the next Black book to come out. Today, I can't possibly keep track of all of them. The amount of content that's come out and the variety of content that's come out over the last 2 decades has just been phenomenal. A lot of that's been fueled by the digital publishing revolution. So pretty much anyone who has an idea and a keyboard can produce a book. Other changes that I've seen over the years is, the nature of the web. The World Wide Web at a time was much more democratic. In other words, you could be a big player or a small player, and you had an equal opportunity to reach an audience. Today, the World Wide Web has really coalesced into the hands of a handful of companies. And the biggest challenge that I face, or anyone, not just booksellers, but anyone on the web, really has to contend with the domination of corporate interests. In the book world, those interests often don't align with ours. So we aren't very well served in a web that's dominated by a handful of white guys in Silicon Valley. And so that's is our biggest challenge. I often tell people that I couldn't start AOBC.com today. It would be an undiscoverable website. So unless you have a lot of money to throw at advertising, it's just exceedingly challenging to become discovered today. AOBC survives simply because I have a ton of content and I've been around 2 decades.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask you. So how do you do it? You've been able to meet that challenge.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things, and I'm willing to learn every day. I'm willing to change tactics. You have to, because Google dominates search, if you want to be discovered in a Google search query, you really have to pay attention to search engine optimization, or SEO. Google has basically dictated rules that if you don't follow, they will bury you in search. So it almost doesn't matter how good your content is. You have to have good content, but you really have to pay attention to search engine optimization. Otherwise, you'd be undiscoverable. The other alternative is to be able to buy ads. But most of the people who are in my position, who are selling books, which aren't the most lucrative things that you can sell on the web, you really have to be creative. The other thing is my audience is extremely supportive. They recognize you don't want Amazon, for example, to be the only place you can buy a book. And we're rapidly going into that direction. If we allow Amazon's algorithm to dictate what books we should be reading, we won't be in the best possible position. So we have to have a vibrant and diverse set of booksellers. And in the Black book space where I operate, we have to have a variety of physical stores. We have to have a variety of websites. We have to have print publications. You really need a vibrant ecosystem of Black booksellers. So AOBC would not survive without my audience, the people who come to the site to buy books. And yeah, they're going to pay a little bit more on some books than on Amazon, but you're also going to be able to get books from my site that you can't get on Amazon. Mm-hmm. So I survive with that support. People who go online and share about the site, people who tell their friends, people participate in discussion forums. All of those people matter. And again, so I can't rely solely on social media. I can't rely solely on search engines, I have to also rely on the people who frequent the site.
How about the Black authors, though? Do the Black authors, do they sort of, and maybe some of the more independent publishers, do they sort of see a way of closing ranks to augment what you're doing and to ensure that those voices that might not otherwise be heard get heard and writings get seen?
Yeah, so no one entity is responsible for all of that, but together they can produce a great variety of books. So whether you're a major publisher, one of the top big 5 New York-based publishers, or whether you're a small independent press, and there are a great many of them scattered throughout the country, or if you're an indie author who's published their own book and is selling it directly, they all create a mix and a great variety of books that are available. And they all take advantage of ALBC. So I have big supporters, and again, in New York City publishing, and I deal with individual authors from all over the place. So so that mix is helpful and benefits the reader.
So we're almost out of time. Just shout out one book we ought to read this summer.
Well, I would strongly recommend you check out The Victory of Greenwood, which is written by Carlos Moreno. ALBC is currently stationed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and that is the home of what's been come to be known as Black Wall Street. And that book talks about 25 important business leaders from the community. And I think it serves as a great inspiration of what we once had, but more importantly, what we could become.
Well, that sounds great. So listen, you've been wonderful, terrific, and we're very grateful for the work you do, and particularly grateful that you were part of this conversation on State of Play.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Welcome back to State of Play. As you know, this is our book special. And we at State of Play have been very lucky. In our short time on the air, we've had some outstanding authors, wonderful historians, subject matter experts, very compelling. And I just don't want to go on, but, we've had people like Ruhan Benjamin with Jim Code, and then we had The State Must Provide about HBCUs and the failure of the government really to provide for them. And then we've had terrific historians, and almost all of them have been incredible, from Carol Anderson to Eddie Glaude to Eric Rauschway and Kate Mazer. But I especially tuned in to Pernell Joseph on The Sword and the Shield.
Well, in popular culture, we usually think of Malcolm and Martin as polar opposites. And the deeper the research I did, I found that instead of Malcolm X being the political sword and Dr. King being the nonviolent shield, I saw them as dual sides of the same revolutionary coin. So they really start off as rivals who become adversaries, who become each other's alter egos. Dr. King's notion of radical Black citizenship is really imbibed by Malcolm X in the Ballad or the Bullet speech. And then Malcolm's notion of radical Black dignity comes to be the central force of Dr. King's life during his last 3 years, where he becomes the radical and then revolutionary king who speaks out against the Vietnam War, against racism, against violence, against imperialism. So I think that instead of having to choose between being Malcolm on Team Malcolm or Team Martin, it's really a context to let people understand that we can be both. And certainly the Black Lives Matter movement has embraced aspects of King's notion of radical Black citizenship and Malcolm's notion of radical Black dignity.
2 books that I'm going to commit to read this summer are Professor Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, and Professor Anderson's book about the Second Amendment.
In my book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, I lay out the somewhat controversial case that our biggest impediment to progress in this country is a zero-sum worldview. The idea, held mainly by white folks, less so by people of color, that progress for one group has to come at the direct expense of the other. $1 more in my pocket means $1 less in yours. And of course, economically, we know that's not the case, right? The racial wealth divide is already costing us trillions of dollars. The racial economic divide, $16 trillion over the last 20 years as measured by Citigroup. The numbers keep being crunched, and the evidence is very clear that our economy overall is poor because of this wealth divide.
One of the things that became clear to me as I started this hunt through our history was the way that the slave states were intent on creating a nation that protected slavery. This is why in the Constitution we get the 3/5 clause, why we get the fugitive slave clause, and why we get the 20-year expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. But it is also why we get the Second Amendment. And that is because during the ratification of the Constitution, Virginia dug in its heels. Patrick Henry and George Mason went toe to toe with James Madison, arguing that having control of the militia under the federal government would leave these slave societies defenseless against a slave revolt, against a slave uprising. So much of the narrative at that time had defined the enslaved and Black people as dangerous, as threats, as criminals. And the thought that there wouldn't be a militia there to protect them was unconscionable for them. And they were determined to have embedded in the Constitution protection for slavery, protection for their right to own human beings and keep the enslaved's rights squashed by this militia.
The beautiful thing about great writing is that it clarifies your own thinking. You know, we stay so busy, go from one thing to the other, we're constantly online. But to have beautiful writing, it just clarifies your thinking. With Eddie Glaude, with Begin Again, trying to think about James Baldwin, and he, you know, how timely that discussion is in 2021. Something that, about James Baldwin's concerns. Eric Rauchway in Why the New Deal Matters. I've always celebrated Franklin Delano Roosevelt because I happen to be a January 30th birthday person myself. But I never appreciated the full depth of what the New Deal meant until we had Eric Rauchway, and now I know through his work how significant it is. And Kate Mazur, you know, I'm from D.C., and she does such a brilliant job of examining Reconstruction and that whole period. But that's when Washington, D.C. also became just a powerful center in this country. And that's the beauty of great writing. And that's also the beauty of not only subject matter experts, but historians, because we're always in an intense moment. And they allow us to get a distance on it. And so much of what we're struggling with today, we've been struggling with over the life of this country. And that has a lot to do with why we still, and had launched State of Play, is to make certain we examine these touchstone issues. And these great authors have helped us do that in a very powerful way. So we've had fun with this special. I hope you have as well.
Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Brandon Jones, and I want to do a book recommendation for State of Play TV. And the book that I want to recommend is by Dr. Rahita Walker, The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. This book is geared towards Black folks getting their emotional wellness together, okay? It's geared for us to get the help that we need, be informed about what mental health is, what it isn't. Even if you're not a reader, you should still pick up this book, read pieces of it at a time. You don't have to go cover to cover right when you get it. Highly recommended. Again, The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health by Dr. Rahita Walker.
Hi, my name is David Leopold. I'm an attorney in Cleveland, Ohio. This summer, I'm reading The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. It's an amazingly, painstakingly researched story of the epic migration of Black Americans from the Jim Crow South to the North in search of a better life for themselves, for their children, a life of dignity, and a life where they could pursue the American dream. The untold history of how America developed socially and economically through that migration. My recommendation this summer is Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. Have a great summer and keep reading.
Welcome back to State of Play. This is State of Play's book special. And we're very fortunate because we now have someone who is quite the personality in this space. She is a real expert on African American literature. She's an English professor at Medgar Evers College in New York. She is the founder and executive director of the Center for Black Literature, and she's the host of a weekly radio show called Writers on Writing. Wonderful to have you with us, Dr. Brenda Greene.
Well, thank you so much, Mayor Pratt. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this platform.
So you've done so much in the space of Black literature, both nurturing talent as well as nurturing young people in this space. What drove you to be in this environment?
Well, I always loved to read. I knew I wanted to be a teacher when I was 5 years old. And I've taught at all levels, elementary, junior high school, and then finally college. And that's why I realized that I could really make a difference. I became involved in helping to coordinate the National Black Writers Conference, which was founded in 1986 and was the vision of the late John Oliver Killens. He wanted to have a forum to discuss Black literature on an annual basis. And because of resources, we could not do that. I ended up becoming the director, and I went on sabbatical in 2000. And while on sabbatical, I wrote a proposal to do two things: to found an English BA program and to found the Center for Black Literature, so that they would work in tandem with each other. And the goal was to institutionalize the National Black Writers Conference and to provide the general public with information about Black writers, and to do that through conferences, symposia, workshops, educational programs, and the radio show.
Well, that's great. So given the intensity of the political environment, given all of the dynamics around racial justice and lack of justice, has that impacted and influenced the type of literature that you see?
Most definitely. There's an African proverb that says, until the lion tells his story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And so what you have now in this racial pandemic, and this the rise in the Black Lives Matter movement, the spillover from what hip hop artists did and the Black arts movement, you have people who are telling their stories. And they're doing it in varying ways. Cheryl Wall, a literary critic who we lost last year, talks about blurring the line. They're blurring genres and they're writing texts that expand the narrative, that create counter narratives. So you have Colson Whitehead doing the Underground Railroad and incorporating magical realism. You have Ta-Nehisi Coates doing the Water Dancer. You have people who are talking about the importance of talking about those subjects we normally don't have, like Britt Bennett, who did The Vanishing Half, talks about racial passing. Confessions in B Flat. Donna Hill, who's a romance novelist, but she decided to do a novel which focuses on the civil rights movement and talks about the impact of the philosophies of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and how that played out. You have people doing memoirs. My son, Talib Kweli, just wrote a memoir. He's a hip hop artist, Vibrate Higher, telling his story. Natasha Deathway, who was the poet laureate, telling her story of her mother who was actually murdered and what grief and trauma is about. You have Not Our President. This is a book of essays by Hakeem Mahabudi. So you have people who are telling expanded stories of autobiography and biography, who are talking about the critical analysis of race and class. Just Us in American Conversation, Claudia Rankine, which really I think is more for people who need to understand what it means to be Black in America. Of course, Isabel Wilkerson with Cass, Keith Lamont, who did a book of essays, How to Slowly Kill Yourself in America. On Juneteenth, a book that just came out by Annette Gordon-Reed, which helps us understand the myths and the contradictions of slavery. So you have these expanded conversations on race and politics, and you have our story getting told.
You're talking about such richness. What is happening on the publishing side? I mean, do you see the same trends that and changes that need to happen among publishers?
I think among publishers is moving very slowly. There are people who are aware, there are publishing agencies who are aware that they need to have more diversity. But it's really, really hard to get into that system. If you look at the people who go in at the entry level, they're really in there because they love to read and they might love to write and they want to do editing. It's not a job where you're going to make money, so you have to really love it. And so the publishing houses end up really kind of replicating themselves. There's a need to have more Black people in editing, more Black agents, more Black people in publicizing. And we're seeing a little shift. Lisa Lucas, who was head of the National Book Foundation, it's interesting that there's a correlation between the number of people who number of writers who received awards when she became president, and you compare that to what happened previously. So as we begin to put more people in positions where they can have influence and impact what is happening in the publishing area, what is happening in the larger literary scene and landscape, I think we're going to see a change, but there's more work that needs to be done.
And from what I've read, you're also sort of working on the other end of the spectrum, right? You are trying to drive the interest and open exposure of all this wonderful literature and writers to a younger audience. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, one of our highlights of our program is called Re-envisioning Our Lives Through Literature. And it really speaks to the need to get kids, young people, we've done it at middle school, elementary school, and high school, but we primarily work in high school to get them excited and engaged about writing and about literature. So part of the program, we buy books and they have to read the books, or we actually give them a series of essays around a particular theme. They create their own stories and scripts. They put them into an anthology. They do a production at the end, and the warmth and the sense of community that it creates is so exciting. Where it's changed people's lives. One of our teaching artists who started with us about 15 or 17 years ago said he's working in Miami. He met a student who he worked with in one of our high schools who's now teaching in a charter school. And this student told him, "You changed my life about writing." Those are the stories that we really like to hear. And that's part of our mission.
Well, I'm going to ask you two questions in one. One of the questions is what book you'd recommend for our audience to read this summer. And also, you've had some fascinating writers on your program, Writers on Writing. Any one of them really kind of had such an extraordinary moment in that interview?
Oh my goodness, there, as you said, there are so many. I think part of what was really exciting to read Tamara Payne's book, she worked with her father, The Dead Are Rising, the story of Malcolm X. That was really, really an exciting interview. I would say The Heads of Colored People, Nafisa Thompson Spires. She gave the story of the Black middle class. We don't often get that story. We get the stories of everything, you're the victim, but what are the children of those who came up through our children, what are they dealing with as Blacks? Racial passing is another topic, the vanishing half. I didn't have an opportunity to interview her, but I would definitely say that she is someone. It's a book people should read. Kies Laymo, How to Slowly Kill Yourself in America, and his book on Heavy, this whole weight consciousness, what it was like to grow up being overweight and how he ended up changing his life. I really like the stories that really speak to the inner life of the particular writer that we go through, that we hear.
Well, you are indeed incredible, and all that you do is incredible, and we were so honored to have you here on State of Play.
Well, thank you so much, and I encourage our listeners and your listeners to really visit the Center for Black Literature. We have an array of programs. We have a large video library of all of our programs. And we have something going on almost every month because we want to connect you. So thank you for giving me this platform to really talk about the work we do and to share with the audience the importance of our work. We're one of the only centers in this country that is doing this work, that's devoted to literature.
I'll talk about a couple of books that I think people might have missed that continue to be some of my favorite books, kind of like classic albums. One is by historian Ira Katz Nelson called When Affirmative Action Was White. What that book essentially does is chronicles the rise of the middle class, or more so, the rise of the white middle class, and the ways that Black people were left out of opportunities when it came to the New Deal. 8 out of 10 men born during the 1920s were drafted to go to war. Part of thinking about that war with World War II is that it created these economic opportunities. Well, Black people were largely left out of that. Why? Because 75% of Black people in the South worked as domestic workers or farm workers. And Roosevelt left off those two occupations out of Social Security. Another book I would say is called Black Wealth, White Wealth. If people want to know just some very troubling trends about how we cannot outclass racism, people should check out that book. And one stat just continues to haunt me. Black people in the highest income category were denied just as much, if not more, than white people in the lowest income category.
Welcome back to State of Play. As you know, this is our first book special, and it has been an exciting journey. We've had writers, we've had bookstore owners, including the Mahogany Bookstore here in Washington, D.C. We've had book club platforms. We've had academics such as Dr. Brenda Greene, who is just extraordinary. And they've all stimulated, I think, all of us to want to even read more fascinating books. So I'm determined now, which I've been working on, and it's a wonderful read, to finish The Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. And also now to weigh in on Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us, as well as Joseph's The Sword and the Shield. So I'll have a lot of great books to read as I head to the beach.
Well, Mayor, I am sort of just like you. I am going to finish Heather McGhee's book, and I really want to begin Professor Anderson's book. And I'm also quite interested in reading Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed. But I think for my light reading this summer, I'm going to grab another Walter Mosley novel. I think his latest one is Bloodgrove. And I really do enjoy reading Walter Mosley's novels.
No better way to spend the summer than doing some reading. We've had some incredible authors on throughout State of Play. And so the three I want to highly recommend: Elizabeth Hinton's From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, Peniel Joseph's The Sword and the Shield, about Martin and Malcolm, powerful. And also the second by Professor Carol Anderson, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. We really ought to get the full history of what the Second Amendment is all about. Enjoy your summer reading.